How do generalized perceptions and stereotypes of female managers influence their opportunities and treatment in their workplace compared to the men counterparts? How did mandated appointment of women to boards in Norway reveal biases through impacts on stock price and company valuation? Why do investors exhibit less faith in companies led by female CEOs compared to males? And how can this bias based on the gender rather than qualifications be overcome?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first talk here at ESG Reports. My name is Ethan, and I'm currently a student in the US.
And this is EQ, a student in China.
Yeah.
And today we're going to talk about female managers, especially their perception about them and some stereotypes about them.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So as you stated, we're talking about female directors today, and more importantly, how these female directors, interact in the workplace. And the reason we bring it up is because female management is only it's like a growing topic in society, right? There's not a lot of well-documented long-term information, we could say, about female directors and how their influences shape companies. And because growing diversity is such a big topic in our society today, and all industries across the board are looking for that, it's a very important societal question that can affect investors, that can affect business managers, potential investors, and it just has influences all around the board, which is why it's so important, right? So Iki, why don't you give us a brief introduction about the different influences, about like the perceptions of women managers in like a more general view and a more societal view?
Well, currently there are persistent gender stereotypes and biases that affect the perception of female directors on their supervisory boards. Like, for example, women are often seen as being more focused on social issues and risk management rather than financial performance and some strategic decision making. And these perceptions are generally influenced by various factors, such as the gender composition of the board, the respondents' gender, and the industry of the company, and also the company size. And it is important to recognize these biases and work towards creating a more inclusive and diverse leadership team. Also, it's not just about addressing those biases, but also about addressing some structural barriers to women's career advancements. Gender bias in hiring and promotion practice, some unequal pay, and as well as the lack of access to leadership development opportunities are all factors that can hold women back from reaching executive positions, and it's also known as some glass ceiling phenomenon.
Yeah. I feel like the gender biases especially play like a big role in and how people view female directors who are like potentially new. Like, for example, we see in like Norway or in the EU, like we see how if I recall back in 2003 there was a mandate by I think it was the Norwegian government that by 2009 all companies had to have at least 40% or somewhere around that number of a certain committee being under female leadership. And we see through the study that how like the day or the few weeks immediately following this announcement, we see how like companies and stocks that in their stock market across the board saw some sort of change, some sort of negative change, ranging from like 0.2%, 0.02%, all the way up to like 3.54%, which is a dramatic change. We see like across the board that there's negative influences, which tells us that for female direct and I'm sorry, let me see if
never mind. We could just add it.
Yeah, it's cool. Sorry, there's a little technical issue there. So yeah, continuing on, we saw how like the changes in like the stock prices, that's like that's a big indicator to like the general society as a whole, and like in the investing world see female directors as like for certain reason potentially not confident enough, especially with if we look at like the Tobin Q value, which diminished across the board in the years afterwards following this announcement, which tells us that these firms are being undervalued with these female leaders, which I mean ultimately that demonstrates like there's a lack of trust in the public with these companies that are with these companies in Norway which have female leaders. And that's quite interesting because we also find that there's actually no significant financial difference. There's no significant like financial performance differences that we find between female and male leaders. And I guess that just goes to further that, you know, there's some sort of like bias here. There's some sort of there's some sort of influence with like with society that doesn't necessarily correlate with like the financial influence. And that's something that we look to address, and that I guess people as a whole look to address in the future, because especially given like this climate of diversity we see.
Sure. So, with this, there must be some form of like stereotypes and gender roles in play.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at it that way. We can see, I guess, considering that, you know, relatively speaking, the growth of like female directors is something that's quite new. Something that's, you know, at least in the U.S., for example, females only really started getting a larger play in society after somewhere around the 1950s, after World War II, after, you know, the turn, and especially now, I guess we could say. But we can see how prior to that, for like as long as humans have been around, there's been this really set male and female traditional gender roles, and that's really being changed nowadays with this, you know, increased diversity, this increased like inclusion of females, because we see how women can do the same job as men's, and you know that's really challenging what, you know, people have been used to for a very long time, right? And so because such change is happening, we also see that, like, for example, the same views that people hold about men and women, it doesn't really change, despite the fact that, you know, people's jobs are changing, people's, you know, the climate is changing, the views stay the same. And I think that's the biggest issue that we face nowadays, right? So you know, in a study we can see in a paper called Exploring the Roles and Impact of Women in Executive Leadership, we see how in this paper it reports that women, for example, are more judged upon their characteristics, upon like their personal characteristics instead of necessarily their expertise. And this was conducted in a study. You know, we see how there's the men who were studied in the same study, they weren't exactly characterized by their personal characteristics in the same way that females were. And I think that points towards, you know, somewhat about the fact that, you know, females are judged more based on stuff that's not necessarily important, but perhaps that has something to do with, for example, traditional gender roles and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really a good point, and it's really important to recognize that in those male-dominated culture, um, there are like an inherently discouraging culture that alongside some gender biases that dictate the perceived role of women. And this like causes many female workers to be appointed to jobs that are more so fit their traditional roles instead of like their professional roles, which are also tend to be like lower position roles that exercise less overall opportunity for firm change. However, I think we are seeing a shift in attitude toward traditional gender roles, and newer generations of workers, they are more like deviating from further from these roles. And this means that we are slowly like erasing those stereotypes and creating a more inclusive culture.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think it's also important to recognize that like this culture that like this culture that's being built like in this like modern society that we live in, women still remain as like the minority in terms of like their roles and the amount, the sheer number of them in like top management positions, right? We see somewhere around like 5 in 100 currently, 5 in 100 managers being women in like Fortune 500 companies, and you know that's basically nothing, right? In the sense of like there's 95 other men to like in the ratio to the 5 females, right? So we can see how you know this growth, it's coming, but it's slow. So I guess at this point it's still a little bit difficult to tell how the true influences will turn out, because currently we don't have like the, you know, like the 50-50, for example, for us to say you know, females are exactly proportional to males, because we simply just can't say that with the given information. You know, some may make the argument that, you know, for example, like the 5 out of 100 that I just pointed out, maybe these 5 women are, you know, they're extremely overqualified and they're like anomaly, perhaps. But we just don't know at this point, because, you know, the information that we have in this culture, you know, it's coming, but it's not here yet, or it is here, but not in the number that we can use to determine like the true influences and potentials of females.
Yeah, and while there are more women's like going to the board, it just like broaden their decision-making choices, and it just like challenge those conventional wisdom and bring up new issues and perspectives to the new board. And
yeah, I mean that's definitely something that's happening, but only time will tell how that turns out, because it's you could say it's dangerous to jump to conclusions, but in this case it's not necessarily dangerous. But yeah, okay. Everyone, thank you for tuning in to the first talk here, short talk here at ESG Reports. We hope you've gained something out of this talk and you've learned something, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
A diverse and inclusive board is a moral imperative for companies seeking to operate ethically and contribute wider social goods. Research that clarifies the relationship between women board directors and ESG outcomes provides an evidentiary foundation for pursuing policies of non-discrimination, equal representation, and unlocking the full potential of female leaders. Beyond fiscal performance, understanding how women's perspectives strengthen environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and governance accountabilities allows organizations to live up to ethical ideals of sustainability, community impact, and integrity. Promoting research that gives insight into the multifaceted value of diversity is itself an act of ethical leadership. With openness, humility, and care, we can elevate facts over biases and shape corporate cultures where all people are empowered to thrive and direct organizations toward good. This is at the heart of both ethical business and the conscientious pursuit of knowledge.